The replay from the past. Around 20 years ago, during an autumn patrol, two officers were sent to investigate reports of a disturbance on the outskirts of Newbury, Berkshire. Dispatch had received calls from locals who claimed to hear shouting and what sounded like a fight coming from a nearby field. No clear details or descriptions of individuals were provided, though only vague accounts of loud and disturbing noises. The officers, both level-headed and experienced, expected to find either a group of teenagers causing trouble or perhaps a domestic argument that had spilled outdoors. When they finally arrived, the scene was quiet and ordinary. The field stretched out under the fading light, bordered by dense hedgerows. A thin layer of mist hung close to the ground, softening the outlines of the surrounding landscape but leaving enough visibility to survey the area. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. Then, climbing over a low wooden fence, the officers stepped onto the frosty grass and began to search the field. Their search yielded nothing unusual. There were no signs of recent activity, being no footprints in the damp soil, no trampled grass, no debris indicating that anyone had been there. Their flashlights swept through the haze, casting long beams over the uneven ground, but they still revealed nothing. Convinced that the reports were either exaggerated or the result of a misunderstanding, they turned back toward their patrol car. As they neared the edge of the field, the stillness shattered. Out of nowhere, the sound of a ferocious fight erupted around them. Shouts, screams, and the clash of weapons filled the air, surrounding them in a deafening uproar. The noise wasn't distant or muffled either, but it was as if they were in the center of an invisible battle. Heavy footfalls and guttural cries echoed from every direction, creating a sense of chaos that contradicted the emptiness of the field. The lead officer later described how disorienting the whole moment felt. Despite the overwhelming noise, though, fear didn't immediately take hold. Instead, he was consumed by confusion, trying to make sense of the situation he found himself in. His training kept him grounded, but the sheer strangeness of the whole experience was undeniable. A quick glance at his partner confirmed that they were both hearing the same thing. The wide-eyed look on his colleague's face had said it all. Neither of them spoke as the sounds continued, with their ears filled with the echoes of a battle that didn't actually exist. Then, after what felt like an eternity but was likely only seconds, the sound stopped abruptly. The field went back to silence as if the chaos had never even occurred. Both officers stood frozen, listening for any lingering noise, but the only thing they could hear was their own breathing. Slowly, they then made their way back to the car, exchanging brief, confused remarks about what had just happened. When the lead officer finally radioed in, he reported that they found no signs of activity in the field and marked the call as resolved, though neither officer truly believed that. The experience lingered in the days that followed. The lead officer couldn't shake the feeling that what they had witnessed wasn't a simple auditory glitch or a misinterpretation of natural sounds. His curiosity led him to research the area, and he discovered that the field was actually near the site of a major Civil War battle. Newbury had seen fierce fighting during the English Civil War, with soldiers clashing on the very ground where the officers had stood. Though he avoided labeling the incident as paranormal, the officer admitted that it felt like an imprint of the past, a moment of intense violence somehow echoing through time. The Little People. A homicide detective received a late-night call one night from dispatch regarding an elderly man who had phoned 911 to report his wife's death. The man claimed responsibility but gave no clear explanation. When asked if anyone else was in the house, he simply replied, "Nobody," which seemed odd at first but wasn't immediately clarified. Arriving at the scene, the detective found the woman deceased on the couch, with their injuries consistent with a blunt head trauma but nothing overly violent. Following standard procedure, he began a walkthrough of the house to secure the scene and ensure there were no potential contaminations. Deputies were stationed in the garage with the husband, who appeared calm and cooperative. The house was unremarkable at first glance, and the rooms were all empty. The detective returned to the kitchen to then discuss the case with the lieutenant. The layout of the house placed the kitchen just out of the view of the front door, with a partial wall separating the two places. The living room where the body was located was just ahead of the entryway. As the two spoke, a sudden creak drew their attention. The unmistakable sound of the front door opening echoed through the house. Annoyed, the detective assumed someone had wandered into the scene. Rounding the corner, he found the door partially ajar, about a foot open, but no one nearby. The screen door that enclosed the porch was still locked from the inside, ruling out any external intrusion. A glance confirmed the heavy-duty steel front door couldn't have been moved by a wind. It required effort to push, and yet there it stood, open without any explanation. The straight line between the open door and the deceased also added a disturbing layer to the whole incident. Returning to the garage, the detective began interviewing the husband. The man, in his late 70s or early 80s, was articulate and cooperative. He recounted how his wife had slipped while exiting the shower and ended up striking her head. Despite his urging, she refused medical attention and insisted on resting. The husband blamed himself for not forcing her to go to the hospital, leading to his guilt-stricken 911 call. The evidence corroborated his account as well, and everything pointed to a tragic accident. Before concluding the interview, the detective asked about the odd statement on the 911 call regarding not being alone in the house. The man chuckled, hesitant to explain, before finally confessing his belief in little people that lived in the home. He described them as mischievous, claiming they would flush toilets, move items, and open doors. Though he'd never seen them directly, he was convinced of their presence. The detective's skepticism softened when the man asked if the front door had opened earlier. The man seemed relieved to hear it had, thanking the detective for confirming the strange occurrences were not just figments of his imagination. The accidental death was then resolved, but the disturbing series of events lingered. The unexplained door opening and the husband's firm belief in the unseen inhabitants added some unease to an otherwise straightforward case. Leaving the house, the detective couldn't shake the feeling that he'd encountered something beyond the ordinary. The old man and his house. In the late 1980s, in a mid-sized Oregon town once settled by Finnish immigrants, there was a man who lived in a large Victorian-style home for nearly his entire life. He had moved in when he was just 2 years old and remained there well into his 70s. Locals often joked that he and the house had aged together, both showing the wear and tear of time. The man was no recluse, but his views, especially his openly racist tendencies, didn't endear him to everyone. Even so, he had enough friends and acquaintances around town to stay socially active. When he was diagnosed with terminal cancer and given 6 months to live, the news spread quickly. People stopped by to visit him, and he spent his days making peace with the life he'd lived. When his health took a sharp decline, no one was surprised. Then, on a cold, quiet night, a concerned neighbor called the police after noticing the house had been dark for a couple days. 2 officers were then sent to check on him. By the time they arrived, some neighbors had gathered outside with their faces heavy with the weight of what they suspected. The officers then let themselves into the house, which had an air of stillness that felt more oppressive than peaceful. The first thing that the officers noticed was a mounted elk head in the foyer. Its lifeless eyes seemed to follow them as they moved, a detail that stayed with both men as they made their way upstairs. Then, in the bedroom, they found the old man's body on the floor beside his bed. His death appeared natural, but protocol demanded confirmation. After checking for a pulse and calling for an ambulance, they prepared to move the body. With only one paramedic on duty that night, the officers were asked to help carry the body down to the ambulance. As they began the descent, the officer at the front glanced at the elk head again. Something was off. It was now turned to the side, as if watching them from a different angle. Beneath it, scrawled in wet red lettering, was the word Aswa. The officer recognized it as Finnish meaning stay or remain. He reached out to touch the writing, realizing it was fresh blood dripping from the elk's mouth. His pulse quickened as he called out to the others, who hurried over to see the sight for themselves. The paramedic, visibly shaken, urged them to move quickly. As one of the officers then stepped outside to open the ambulance, every light and siren on the emergency vehicle suddenly blared to life, breaking the stillness of the night. The cacophony startled the onlookers, who began retreating into their homes. Then, without warning, the house's windows shattered inward and the entire front porch gave way, collapsing in a slow, almost deliberate fashion. The sound of snapping wood and falling debris also filled the air as dust and splinters clouded the scene. The officer who had stepped outside turned back, horrified to see his partner and the paramedic struggling amidst the chaos. Running to help, he found his partner trembling, muttering the same phrase over and over. He sat up. He sat up. It took a few moments before the officer could get a coherent explanation. His partner claimed that as the porch collapsed, the old man's body had ripped free from the body bag and let out a guttural, inhuman scream. The officer, trying to maintain his composure, found the body sprawled on the collapsed porch, with its face frozen in an expression of pure terror. He hastily covered it with a tarp and guided his partner away from the wreckage. The paramedic, pale and silent, refused to re-enter the house, and another ambulance was called to assist. Meanwhile, the first officer returned to his car to fill out the report, though he struggled to find words to describe what had just occurred. By morning, word of the incident had spread, and the house became the subject of whispered stories and hushed warnings. No one dared to step foot near it, and it remained in its collapsed state, untouched. Those who lived through the event rarely spoke of it, but the story still lingered, becoming a dark part of the town's history. To this day, locals avoid the house, believing something unnatural still resides within its crumbling walls. Just saying hello. A few years ago, during the early hours of a quiet night patrol, an officer was making rounds near a small airport nestled deep in the woods. The airport, which consisted of a few hangars and a central office building, had a history of break-ins, so it was part of the routine patrol route. On this particular night, sometime between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., something unusual happened. While driving past the airport, the officer heard an audible alarm coming from the darkened building. The sound was distinct and persistent, yet no dispatch had alerted him to an issue, nor had there been any calls reporting an alarm. The officer called in and parked, cautiously approaching the main office. He checked every entry point, being doors, windows, and even the garage. All were securely locked, and nothing seemed out of place. With no signs of forced entry, the officer waited for the key holder to arrive and unlock the building for a more thorough check. Within minutes, the key holder and his wife showed up. They opened the door and the officer began clearing the office, the garage, and the rest of the building. Everything was in order, meaning that there was no evidence of a break-in or disturbance. The key holder, however, looked puzzled. The officer learned that the alarm wasn't part of a motion detection system. Instead, it was triggered by a specific cash register inside the office. According to the key holder, the register could only be opened by pressing a well-concealed button, a design implemented by his late father. Only 3 people knew where the button was, being the key holder himself, his wife, and his father, who had passed away some time ago. The cash register, now fully open, was still secure, with all its contents intact. But there was no sign of tampering or anyone else having accessed it. The key holder then explained that the register couldn't be opened accidentally. Without pressing the hidden button, it simply wouldn't budge. The officer then confirmed that on his earlier patrol a few hours prior, there had been no alarm or activity. The key holder smiled, a mix of nostalgia and acceptance evident in his expression. He recounted how his father had founded the airport and spent his life immersed in aviation, dedicating himself to its success. The airport and everything tied to it had been his father's greatest pride and joy. The key holder believed that moments like this were his father's way of making his presence known, drawing his family back to the airport, perhaps just to remind them that he was still watching over it. The phantom phone calls. In the winter of 1995, an odd string of incidents began to unfold in the now abandoned building of a hospital complex. The building, constructed in 1856, had been a long-standing symbol of the town's past, with its thick walls and towering oak doors embodying a history of care for the mentally ill. By that time, though, it was little more than a cold, empty shell devoid of power, heating, and even telephones. Yet it was precisely this building that became the focal point for a mystery. Basically, one cold night around 2 a.m., the hospital operator received an unexpected call from the local police. They reported that their station was receiving calls originating from inside the building. Given that the building had been closed for months with its phone lines disconnected and no inhabitants, the operator dismissed the report as impossible. But the police still insisted, prompting the shift supervisor and his team of 3 guards to investigate. Walking through the building at night was disturbing enough. The building was entirely unheated, with temperatures well below freezing. A burst pipe from the previous week had left 2 floors coated in a thick layer of ice, causing their flashlights to reflect shadows that seemed to dance. The guards then properly searched every floor, every room, and every abandoned phone jack. Despite their thorough sweep, though, they found no trace of any person or working phone. Reporting their findings to the operator, they returned to their post, confident that the building was now empty. Their relief was, however, short-lived. 10 minutes later, the operator called back, saying that new calls from the building were still coming through, and that the police demanded further investigation. The guards had no choice but to return, splitting up to search once again. This time, the operator was able to provide real-time updates, tracing the active calls to specific locations within the building. One call was coming from a nursing station on the N16 unit. A guard had rushed there, only to find the room now empty. As he checked in, the operator redirected him to the N16 lounge, located at the opposite end of the unit. Again, though, nothing. Then came the most disturbing update yet, that the call was now coming from the N16 elevator phone. The guard ran to the elevator, standing before its heavy, unpowered doors, while the operator confirmed that the call was still active. The phone calls continued, seemingly jumping from one location to another, as if playing a sinister game of hide-and-seek. Yet no phones remained in the building, and there was no logical explanation at all for the activity. After hours of chasing shadows, the guards decided to call it a technical issue. The operator contacted the phone company to send an engineer first thing in the morning. The next day, the shift supervisor stayed beyond his shift, curious to see what the engineer would uncover. The engineer initially suggested that the phone lines had been likely reassigned and that the calls were coming from people using those lines elsewhere. However, a detailed inspection revealed something more puzzling, that the lines had not been reassigned. Not only were they still live, but they were somehow active within the building itself. To eliminate the issue, the engineer disabled the lines entirely. Yet the phone calls still persisted for another 2 weeks. Each time the source was traced to various points within the building, always with the same eerie results, being empty rooms, no phones, and no explanation. Then, as abruptly as they had begun, the calls had stopped. Despite numerous investigations and checks, no one ever determined the true cause. The building was then demolished the following year, taking its secrets with it. The driver in the front seat. One night during a routine patrol, an officer came across a car parked alone in the middle of a quiet church parking lot. The church sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees, and its lot was often deserted after dark. Curious, and with the parking lot being a known hangout for teenagers, the officer pulled up from the side to just check on the situation. The car appeared empty, with its interior dark and still, and the officer figured it might have been abandoned or stolen and left there. As the officer moved his patrol car behind the vehicle to run the plates, he glanced through the back window of the car, and that's when he froze. Staring back at him through the rearview mirror was the unmistakable reflection of someone sitting in the front seat. Their eyes seemed to lock onto his, unblinking, as if they'd been watching him the entire time. Years of experience with traffic stops had sharpened his ability to recognize when someone in a vehicle was paying him close attention, and the figure's gaze carried an intensity that sent an immediate jolt of adrenaline through him. The officer realized he had made a mistake. He hadn't noticed anyone in the car earlier, and now it seemed clear that someone was there. Bracing himself, he repositioned his patrol car next to the vehicle, ready to confirm what he'd seen. But as his headlights swept through the car, his confusion deepened. The front seat was now completely empty, as was the rest of the vehicle. There was no sign of anyone inside. A chill crept over him, a sensation as visceral as it was undeniable. He scanned the area with his flashlight, searching for any movement or a shadow, but the lot remained eerily quiet. The figure he had seen so vividly reflected in the rearview mirror had now vanished without a trace. The key holder. An officer and his partner once responded to a late-night call about a triggered alarm at a medical office building. The structure was old, with its brick facade hinting at a past life before being repurposed into doctors' offices, with a pharmacy attached on the ground floor. Dispatch had reported that the motion sensor picking up activity was located in an office on the second floor, a detail that already had the officers on edge. Then, upon arrival, they were greeted by a man claiming to be the key holder. He seemed calm and professional, holding a ring of keys in his hand. Together, they entered the building, where the man led them to the stairwell door. Oddly, he admitted he didn't have the keys for that particular door, so they took the elevator instead. As the elevator doors opened on the second floor, the officer stepped into a long, dimly lit hallway. Most of the overhead lights were out, except for a single lamp at the far end that barely cast its glow across the dark corridor. The space felt cold and still, with its silence broken only by the faint hum of the building's old electrical system. The two officers then began their sweep, checking door after door along the hall. Each one was locked, giving them little cause for concern. But as they reached the final office, they found the door unlocked. Pushing it open, they entered what appeared to be a recently vacated space. The reception area was empty, with no papers or personal belongings, and each exam room was similarly bare. After a thorough check, they confirmed the area was clear and headed back into the hallway. The moment they stepped out of the office, though, something felt wrong. The overhead light that had been at the end of the hall was now by the elevator, casting a shadowy glow in the opposite direction. The sudden shift was disorienting, and when the lead officer glanced at his partner, he noticed his partner's face had gone pale. "Those doors we just checked," his partner muttered. "They were locked, right?" They turned to look down the hall, and every door they had checked was now wide open. The officers, both disturbed but determined, retraced their steps, peering into each room again. Once more, everything appeared untouched. As they moved back toward the elevator, a loud bang echoed through the corridor. The main door at the end of the hall had somehow slammed shut. Without wasting another second, they stepped into the elevator and descended to the ground floor, hoping to regroup with the key holder. But when they emerged into the lobby, the man was nowhere to be found. Assuming he might have stepped out, the officer contacted dispatch to track him down. The response they received chilled them to their core. The dispatcher informed them that the key holder, a woman, was still on her way and would arrive in about 5 minutes. The officers were stunned, who then had accompanied them into the building. When the actual key holder finally arrived, she was understandably confused by their story. As they described the man who had let them in, her expression darkened. The man they described, she revealed, was the same doctor who used to lease the second-floor office. She explained that he had recently taken his own life at the home just a few days prior. The girl in the yard. A call came in late one stormy evening from an elderly woman who sounded anxious. She reported seeing a young girl running through her yard and feared the situation could escalate to vandalism or something much worse. The officer assigned to the call made his way to the residence, with his car wipers struggling to keep up with the heavy downpour. The flashes of lightning and low rumble of thunder added an eerie undertone to what seemed at first like a routine check. When the officer finally arrived, the woman, clearly distressed, led him to the yard where the figure had been spotted. Armed with a flashlight, he made his way through the rain-soaked grass, scanning every corner. "Is anyone out there?" he called out, with his voice barely carrying over the storm. Only the sound of thunder responded. Satisfied there was no one outside, he headed back to the house to reassure the woman. He found her trembling in a corner with her eyes wide with fear. "She's inside the house," she whispered. Before he could respond, a muffled thump echoed through the dimly lit hallway. Startled, the officer turned and caught the sight of a young girl no older than 13 darting from one side of the house to the other. Her silhouette briefly passed through a patch of light before disappearing down the hall. Instinctively, he followed, calling out for her to stop, but as he rounded the corner, there was no one there. She had now vanished without a trace. The officer paused, trying to rationalize what he'd seen. Perhaps it was a trick of the light or his imagination hidden by the storm. But before he could dwell on it, the woman's trembling voice cut through the air again. There she is, right outside," she cried, pointing toward a large window overlooking the backyard. The officer spun around to see the same girl running through the rain-soaked yard, with her form flickering in and out of visibility under the flashes of lightning. The sight sent a chill down his spine. Confused and on edge, he bolted for the back door, determined to catch her. But when he stepped outside, the yard was now empty. The rain had washed away any chance of finding footprints, and there was no sign of movement. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Unable to make sense of the events, the officer returned to the house and tried to calm the elderly woman. He told her the girl had likely fled and assured her there was no immediate danger. Still, as he left the property, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Months later, news reached him that the elderly woman had passed away. Her house had now been sold and a new family had moved in. But it wasn't long before dispatch received another call from the same address. The new tenants reported seeing a young girl running through the backyard and, more disturbingly, appearing inside their home without explanation. When the call came in, the officer quietly passed it off to another unit, unwilling to step foot on their property again. A call for help. An elderly couple had lived in a rundown ranch house about 20 miles outside of town for years. After the husband passed away, the woman began calling 911 several times a week, requesting help with tasks that were far from emergencies. "I need help turning the thermostat up," she'd say, or "I can't figure out how to boil water for tea." Her requests were simple, almost childlike, but the dispatchers understood that she was alone and likely struggling. Over time, her voice became a familiar sound, and her address was one they all recognized before she even finished her sentences. As time passed, her calls began to shift. Her dementia had worsened, and now she believed she was calling her late husband for help. Every call began the same way. "John, I need help. Please come home and help me." It was heartbreaking to hear the desperation in her voice, With her repeated pleas to a man who could no longer answer her, the dispatchers, though used to her, couldn't help but feel the weight of those calls. Then, one cold winter night, a call came in the same as always. "John, I need help. Please come home and help me, John." First responders were sent to check on her. When they arrived, they found her lying motionless in her bed. She had passed away, likely from the bitter cold, as the heater in her house had failed and the temperature inside had dropped to 50 degrees. The responders then confirmed that the call had come from her, even though rigor mortis had already set in. It was strange, but easily explained as a timing coincidence. The real mystery, though, started after her death. Despite her passing, the calls continued. For over a year, dispatch received the same desperate plea: "John, I need your help. John, please come home and help me." Each time, first responders were sent to the property, but it was always the same. The house was empty and there was no sign of anyone nearby. The strange experience at the hotel. A security guard assigned to a hotel encountered an experience that still lingers in their memory. The hotel, despite being in a decent area, had an unusual history of break-ins. Addicts had been breaking into the third and fourth floors, trashing rooms and threatening staff and guests. Although the activity had stopped by the time the security team was brought in, the disturbing energy still remained, especially on the vacant upper floors. The guards' nightly patrol began routinely enough. The building, shaped like a bird with two long wings angling back from a central hallway, housed around 50 rooms per floor. During their shifts, the guests were confined to the lower floors and the upper ones remained locked and unused. Yet, every night, the light in room 439 on the fourth floor was inexplicably on. It became a regular task to go up and turn it off. These weren't just faulty lights, but it was a flip switch clearly being turned on. The front desk clerk and custodian, the only others on duty at night, insisted they never went to those floors. For weeks, this was the only oddity, though it was enough to make the guard uneasy. Room 439 was untouched, sitting spotless amid several other rooms that had been vandalized. Each time the guard entered, the room seemed subtly altered. A drawer left slightly open, a pillow misplaced, or even a picture frame crooked. No matter how many times these details were adjusted, the unease deepened during the third week. While patrolling outside late one night, a rabbit emerged from a bush near the base of the building, paused to look at the guard, then looked up toward 439 before hopping away. It happened again the next night, and the one after that. The pattern felt deliberate, as though the animal was trying to convey something. The guard, skeptical but unsettled, avoided dwelling on the connection. That same week, while approaching 439 during a routine patrol, the guard's flashlight began to strobe. The closer they got to the door, the worse it flickered, finally dying altogether as they stepped inside. The room's oppressive atmosphere made their skin crawl. Shaken, they locked the door and reported the experience to the front desk clerk, who decided to investigate alongside them. Together, they ascended to the room. Then, as they approached, the guard's flashlight strobed again, confirming the eerie pattern. When the door was unlocked, the light failed entirely, plunging them into darkness. The clerk turned on the room's light, but after a quick look around, admitted they felt physically ill standing in the room and quickly left. Later that same night, at around 4 a.m., the guard decided to address the unseen force directly. Standing in the room, they declared their intention to stop returning, demanding whatever presence lingered to leave them alone. That decision quickly backfired. As they descended the nearby emergency staircase, the door to 439 slammed open behind them. Heavy footsteps pounded toward the stairwell, and the stairwell door itself creaked open. Frozen, the guard turned to see the door slowly closing on its own, with its footsteps stopping abruptly. Panicked, they stumbled down the stairs and shared the encounter with the front desk clerk. For the remaining days of their assignment, they avoided the fourth floor entirely, unwilling to provoke whatever force inhabited the space. Conversations with fellow officers revealed that several of them had also felt an inexplicable sickness or unease in 439, though none had experienced the escalation the guard had faced. By the end of their contract, the guard was relieved to leave the site behind. Whatever haunted that room and the hotel remained a mystery they were glad not to solve. To this day, they have never returned and have no intention of finding out what might still linger there. About 8 years ago, during a heavy downpour, an elderly woman called 911 with an odd concern. She explained that she often heard footsteps coming from upstairs, though she lived alone, which was weird. This time, she was convinced that it was a ghost, so she wanted to call. The dispatcher, used to fielding odd calls, sent officers to her residence, primarily to ensure that she was safe. While waiting for help, the woman stayed on the line, with her voice trembling with fear. A few minutes later, she reported something more immediate, that a man was standing outside her sliding glass door, staring directly at her. Her voice grew more panicked as she described his motionless figure, barely visible in the rain. The man didn't move, didn't speak, but just stood there. Then, as quietly as he had appeared, he slipped out of sight. The officers arrived about 12 minutes after the initial call. One officer stayed with the woman in the foyer, speaking softly to reassure her, while the other headed to the backyard to search for any sign of the man. But the yard was now empty, with no visible footprints or disturbances despite the rain. The officers then decided to conduct a thorough sweep of the house just to be sure that there was no one. It was in the living room, the one with the sliding glass door, that they found something completely unexpected, being a trail of muddy footprints leading across the floor. The footprints were fresh and unmistakable. There was clear indication that someone had been inside the house. The officer then questioned the woman, asking if she had gone outside or if she had had any visitors recently. She shook her head, explaining that she rarely left the house and that she lived alone. Her frail condition, failing eyesight, and poor hearing made her rely heavily on others for assistance, but she hadn't seen anyone that day. Piecing together what had happened, the officers realized the truth. The man that she had described wasn't standing outside. She had seen his reflection in the glass, mistaking him for someone in the backyard. In reality, though, he had been mere feet away in the same room, silently watching her as she stood frozen, speaking to the dispatcher. The officers found nothing else out of place, no signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, and no damage. They couldn't determine the man's intentions, but the thought of him being so close without the woman realizing was really disturbing. Had she not been on the phone, the situation might have ended very differently. Even now, the officers involved described the case as one of the most unnerving experiences of their careers, a reminder of how quickly a routine check can take a completely dark turn.